Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Skipbound, and this is the Top 5 Weekly, where myself and my guests run down our top 5 films based on a given topic. This is a special month of videos. I've been planning this for quite a while now, that I was going to use August as a month to just do classic topics. We're not going to pick anything that's in the theaters now, but we're going to do classic topics, things that mean a lot to us, the panelists, myself and my panelists. And let me introduce my panelists before I say the topic. Mr. Andrew Cabral.
Hello, everyone. I am super happy to be here today, or tonight, if you will, depending on where you are in the world. This is a video I hope we would have eventually gotten to, and we are doing our top 5 favorite Hitchcock movies. I hope that's still the topic. Because that's what I prepared for. But yeah, I am as big a Hitchcock fan as you will find. I have seen so many of his movies. I have written papers about his movies. I have watched every behind-the-scenes story thing I can find. Studied his work. So yeah, this is a big one for me. But I'll try to keep my thoughts not make them too lengthy, or else this is gonna be a really long show.
Yeah, both you and now Mark, I know you both love Hitchcock as much as I do, so I know you guys could go on at length about him. And my other panelist this evening, someone, like I said, I knew who was a big Hitchcock fan, Mr. Mark Tordai.
Oh, I must have misunderstood you because I'm preparing for the top 5 Brett Ratner movies. I'm sorry. Am I in the wrong? Anyway, I'm kidding. Yeah, so I love Hitchcock. Don't love Brett Ratner. Personal experience. Anyway, and yeah, thanks for having me. I do appreciate it. And man, Hitchcock is next to Kubrick is my favorite filmmaker ever. So yeah, we got a lot to talk about in the short time that we have, but we will get everything. We'll get everything. We'll get to everything basically.
Yeah, and just so at the end of the show, I'll give you some information about another show that I do with. I've done some episodes with Mark and some episodes with Andrew, and Andrew's done some episodes with Steven, the 52 must-see movies, why they matter. We'll get into that later on. But yeah, it's Alfred Hitchcock. This is the first in a 4-episode series that I'm doing, or we're doing, and I decided what better way to start this series off than with a director, and why not do the classic, probably in my opinion, my favorite classic director. And I think I might, I know Andrew's a big fan of older films, and so is Mark, but I'd be willing to bet, as far as classic directors, this might be at the top of their list as much as it is mine. So I said, well, we're going to do a classic director. Why not Mr. Alfred Hitchcock? And so let's get this ball rolling. And Andrew, take it away. Number 5.
Number 5. My number 5 is a film many are probably not familiar with in Alfred Hitchcock's filmography, and I'm going with Rebecca from 1940. This was his first American film, his first Hollywood film. He made the trek over from British film into here. He signed a 7-picture deal with David O. Selznick, who was running RKO at the time. He didn't quite make 7 films, but that's a story for a different time. But Rebecca is an adaptation of a classic book that you can find in bookstores today of the same name by Daphne du Maurier. She wrote a couple of books that he actually adapted, but this film stars Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine, and this was kind of my first exposure or experience with Joan Fontaine and really Laurence Olivier. I hadn't seen much from him, and I had first seen this film years ago. And what I love about this film so much is that it's a gothic romance, it's a mystery, it's just really engrossing to me. The story is both a suspenseful and kind of creepy at the same time, but the acting is just fantastic. Joan Fontaine, I think, should have won an Oscar for this movie. She didn't. She ended up winning for Suspicion, which is a film that came out after Rebecca, I think 1 year after Rebecca. And this is just an extraordinary film, and I've always loved its feel and its atmosphere. And there is just a character in this film portrayed by Judith Anderson of Mrs. Danvers, who is the head maid, if you will, and she's just creepy. And there's a mystery behind her, and there's so much hidden meaning behind her and her relationship with the other wife of the Laurence Olivier character, and it is just a fantastic film with a lot of depth to it. So I highly recommend checking out Rebecca if you want to see something that is not traditional Alfred Hitchcock.
And Mark?
My number 5 is a movie I actually just saw a couple nights ago that I had to put on my list, and that's Rope with Jimmy Stewart. Wow. I mean, I love, and I have to bump Strangers from a Train from my number 5 because Rope is absolutely amazing. It is a very deeply philosophical story. And it's a play. I mean, it was a play and they adapted it into a movie. But when you watch this, I mean, it's in one location. The camera basically is set up as if it's all one long shot. Of course, it isn't. They do take several takes where they zoom in on a character and then they zoom out. But it is an incredibly well-rehearsed, well-acted, amazingly shot movie. And I love films that feel like plays, that take place again in one location, that have a few characters, and it's all just story. It's all just dialogue, because that's the most, in my opinion, the hardest to do and the most riveting. So I love the theme. I love the story. I love the acting. And it's really quite an innovative film, and Jimmy Stewart is amazing. He appears more toward the end. He's not necessarily in the whole film, but when he appears, and then he appears a second time closer to the end, and that sequence after he kind of appears a second time is just amazing. And even the last 10 minutes are so fantastic. So I would really encourage people who enjoy theater and also who do love, of course, Hitchcock and the suspense thriller, please watch Rope. It is an incredible film, and I'm very glad that I saw it just a couple nights ago.
Yeah, both great films so far, guys. I'm going to go with a film that Mark and I talked about on that special series I talked about, 52 must-see movies and why they matter. We did a complete half hour on this film. I don't have that much time to talk about it, but North by Northwest is an absolute fantastic film. Cary Grant. One of my favorite things about Hitchcock is he takes an average guy, just a guy walking down the street, a banker, a lawyer, just a normal guy, and puts him in abnormal circumstances. And that's what happens to Cary Grant in North by Northwest. Roger Thornhill is just a normal guy. He's like an investment banker or advertising executive. Yeah. He's an advertising executive. And he's thrust into this whole story about spies and microfiche and all this stuff. And, rest in peace, Martin Landau. Martin Landau plays like a henchman in this film. This is one of his first films he ever was in. He's fantastic in this film. James Mason is in this. You may have seen James Mason. He's crept up in like James Bond. He's crept up in all kinds of different TV shows and different. He plays a good villain. He's got like this great accent, this great voice, and but we also have Eva Marie Saint in here, and she's part of a theme we will be getting through in this episode of the Top 5 Weekly. The Hitchcock Blondes. The Hitchcock Blondes is like, everybody knows about the Hitchcock Blondes. So Eva Marie Saint is one of those Hitchcock Blondes, and she was in North by Northwest. It's just a far kind of reaching kind of film. It just goes all over the place. But the most famous thing about this film that everybody remembers is he's in a wheat field in Iowa, and there's a plane trying to kill him. And then it shoots a gas tanker, and it explodes, and it runs into this. He tricks it into running into this gas truck, and so the plane hits the truck and it explodes out in the middle of this Iowa cornfield. It's just a crazy, crazy film. But another film that's similar to it, that's an earlier, alluded to what Andrew said. He did some films. Hitchcock did films in Britain before he came over to the United States. And a film that is not the same film, but it's a different film, but it has a lot of the same beats. It's called 39 Steps. Now, 39 Steps, this is the precursor to 39 Steps. But they're both great, great films. So I highly recommend, if you haven't seen 39 Steps, see that film. But North by Northwest is an absolute all-time classic. And Cary Grant is fantastic in the film. And it's one of Hitchcock's greatest. Sorry I went on a whole tangent there, but I thought that was a lot of info I had to get in. So back to you, Andrew, with your number 4.
My number 4 is another Hitchcock film that I don't think many people have heard much about, and that is Notorious from 1946, and it is starring Cary Grant and my favorite actress of all time, Ingrid Bergman, and this is one of Alfred Hitchcock's espionage film. This film is kind of the basis for what you would see in James Bond films that would come out, 20 years later in the 60s. It has an undercover agent aspect to it. It has an evil foreign guy portrayed by the great Claude Rains, who is essentially a former Nazi who's kind of the head of this underground cell in, I believe, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And basically, Ingrid Bergman has to go undercover for the American government because her father had ties to pro-Nazi sympathizers and stuff like that. And she ends up developing a relationship with her handler, who's essentially Cary Grant. And they could develop a romantic relationship. And it's really just one of my favorite Hitchcock films. I've watched it so many times. I've written a paper about it. And it deals with a lot of different elements. And Ingrid Bergman is exquisite in it. And Cary Grant showing a bit of a different side for him. He's typically someone who started his career doing comedies, but then kind of transitioned to more serious roles. And this is kind of one that kind of goes both ways. He's both funny and charming in this film, as well as serious and dramatic. And it's always been one of my favorite of Hitchcock's films. And it's one I think is underrated. Not a lot of people talk about it, and I think it's definitely worth mentioning. There's a lot of films he did in the 1940s that I think are worth mentioning. I mean, we've already touched on, Mark has already touched on Rope, which was one of his later 40 films from 1948, I believe. And Dan's already touched on one from the 50s, and we'll probably touch on more from the 50s because he pretty much owned that decade when it came to his filmography that we'll get into.
All right, Mark, what's your number 4?
Mine is The Birds. The Birds is a terrifying movie. I guess it's from the 60s, I believe, correct? The early 60s, I think, or late 50s, early 60s?
I think it's 62.
It's 62. So, yeah, this is kind of the nature versus, man horror film. It's something that, I remember my mom went to see when she was a teenager, and she'd always scared her. I didn't see it until maybe, I don't know, 7 years ago, let's say 6, 7 years ago. But I felt that it held up as far as the terror, as far as that suspense, which, of course, Hitchcock did so well. And I really, really love that shot toward the end when, of course, they walk out of, I guess it's a diner that they're in, and all the birds are just sort of there. They're all just sitting there, and they have to walk through. Of course, I'm a huge Simpsons fan. The Simpsons did a little parody of that years ago where they're all just trying to walk through, and they're all just so terrified of what's going to happen. And I love the fact that you don't even really know why the birds are pecking people's eyes out. Like, there's not really a reason. It's just, these are just some terrible, terrible avian people, avian species, and they're doing terrible things. And that's all you need to know is just survive. And yeah, I still think that a lot of the effects, obviously, of course, they are outdated, but there's a lot of things that do hold up, especially again, the terror, that psychological terror that Hitchcock obviously was a master of. So it is my number 4, and it's also like something as a child I want to say too, that my mom always told us not to watch, one of those films where she thought, oh, it's going to be too scary and don't watch this. So there was this buildup of that movie, almost like a legend, and then when I finally saw it, I understood, of course, why people were so terrified with it, 50, 55 years ago. So yep, that's my number 4.
Yeah. We're going to get into talking more about the birds before this episode is over. I'll tell you that. My number 4 is another film that Mark and I talked about on the 52 must-see movies and why they matter. Yep. Rear Window. Jimmy Stewart is classic Jimmy Stewart here. And if another theme throughout Hitchcock's films is Jimmy Stewart. He worked with him 4 times on some of the best Hitchcock films. And we're going to get into some more of those films as this episode of the Top 5 Weekly goes on. But I'm going to talk about Rear Window, a film that Mark and I talked about on the Top 5, the 52 must-see movies and why they matter. And there's a reason why it's in that book by Robert Osborne. It is an absolute classic film. It's got Grace Kelly in here, and she's his buddy, and he's got a broken leg. He's a photographer, gets in front of a car and gets hit by a car or something, breaks his leg, so he's in his apartment, and he's stuck in his apartment. Of course, when you're doing nothing, you start to see things. You start to look around. You start to get a little bit nosy. And this guy's apartment happens to be like in an area where he could see out his window and see all these other apartments and see all these other people. We got a ballerina, we got a jewelry salesman, we got newlyweds, we got old ladies. We got all these different kinds of people from all walks of life that live in this area. And of course we see something that seems a little suspicious, and Jimmy Stewart really plays up on this whole story about the man next door and his wife disappeared and all this stuff. And I love how Hitchcock really makes you feel like you're in this film with the Jimmy Stewart character, with the main character. You feel like you're in that apartment. You're looking out the windows. You're seeing what's going on with him, and you're seeing all the clues that he's seeing. And so when people don't believe him, like his girlfriend or his police buddy, So this is what's great about Hitchcock. He puts, like I said before, he takes a normal person, puts them in an abnormal situation, and then let the fans, the people watching, let our imagination, the character's imagination, whatever, go wild. And that's what is one of the great things about Hitchcock films. You don't know where the story is going to come from. It starts out just a normal person, and I love Wendell Corey plays his buddy, police officer guy that helps him. He's the detective. The main bad guy in the film is Raymond Burr. You may remember him from a couple TV shows that he was on, very popular TV shows in the 70s and 80s. And of course, Grace Kelly. So that's why I have Rear Window at number 4 on my top 5 Hitchcock films. Going to Andrew for number 3.
Before I get into my number 3, the 2 films these guys talked about are just fantastic. They're all-time classics. What I find so interesting about The Birds is that there's concept art for another ending where they do escape, like the scene Mark was suggesting, and they drive to San Francisco. And when they get to San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge is covered in birds. Yeah. And they didn't have the budget to shoot that ending, so we got the ending that we got. And I just always found that would have been an amazing ending. And I would have loved to have seen that. And that came out in 63, not 62. I thought I had to correct myself, or else I couldn't consider myself a true Hitchcock fan. But my number 3 is one that Dan already mentioned, and that is North by Northwest. This is what I like to call Alfred Hitchcock's James Bond film, with Cary Grant as the James Bond that never got to be James Bond. And it's really interesting how, once again, you see a film dealing with kind of a precursor to this espionage type genre that would come out with James Bond in just a few years after this. Dr. No would come out in '62, I believe, and initially they wanted Alfred Hitchcock to direct Dr. No, but he had already directed North by Northwest, so he felt that it would have just been the same movie. And this film, like Dan says, deals with this microfiche film that is kind of a MacGuffin, just something that people are after, but it doesn't really matter because it's more about the journey than it is the destination. And Eva Marie Saint, who is one of those Hitchcock blondes that Hitchcock became famous for. There's a train sequence in this film that has such great dialogue between her and Cary Grant that just filled with sexual innuendo, saying stuff that you couldn't say on screen in the 1950s and get away with. Yeah. So Hitchcock had to hide all of the sexual things in his movies with innuendo, with kind of symbols and stuff like that. In The Birds, there's certain symbols, sexual symbols as well. But yeah, North by Northwest is one of his greatest films, one of his technical great films as well. Dan mentioned the crop dusting plane sequence where it's been parodied so many times. It's been parodied in Family Guy and The Simpsons and all over pop culture. And it's just a great, great sequence. And I've always been a gigantic fan of Cary Grant. He's one of my favorites. He was a man who could do so many different genres. He could be, the action hero in this film. He could be a comedic actor in other films and put it all together in one film, like he kind of did in North by Northwest. He's running a gamut of all different things. And once again, it plays on this idea of the wrong man scenario, where these people think that the Cary Grant character is someone, and he's really not. He is someone completely different, but he gets roped into this crazy adventure with, of course, starring the great like Dan mentioned, why can't I remember the name? Martin Landau and James Mason, who portray kind of the bad guys in this film. And there's a lot of sexual, maybe homosexual subtext between their characters that, once again, was something that Hitchcock liked to interject in the background of his film. Definitely in Rope, Mark mentioned earlier, a lot of homosexuality undertones in those films, in that film as well. It's kind of like a precursor to what he would do in North by Northwest. And of course, Dan already mentioned 39 Steps, so I won't go into that.
All right, Mark, number 3.
Number 3 is Psycho. Psycho is such a great. There's 2 more that I enjoy a little bit more, but I love Psycho. Psycho is one of those films, again, I saw for the first time, maybe 5-10 years ago, and Psycho, I mean, what can you say? This is probably, I would consider, at least as far as horror movies are concerned, as far as twist endings are concerned, and as far as just creepy films with kind of very disturbing themes, it's like the best. I do like a little, as I said, 2 more, a little bit more, just because I saw them a little bit earlier. But Psycho, Anthony Perkins is so creepy. Vivian Lee, the fact that she is killed like a quarter of the way into the movie, that she's not the star, was a huge gamble. Of course, that's Jamie Lee Curtis's mother. For people who know, and of course she married Tony Curtis, which is who's a wonderful actor. And Martin Balsam, of course, is in the film. He is an amazing actor. He was also one of the 12 Angry Men, which is a masterpiece. And I love the atmosphere of Psycho. I'm a big fan of like hotels, which is another reason why I think The Shining is such a creepy movie. And this is this run down motel. The characters in the beginning, they steal money, and they're just trying to stay out in this little crappy motel somewhere, and of course all hell breaks loose, and they get one hell of a an experience at this Bates Motel. And yeah, as far as pop culture is concerned, I mean, again, The Simpsons did a thing there where someone is attacking, I forget who it was, Homer in the shower, and he pulls down the curtain and the red blood goes through the drain. I mean, it's been parodied, it's been mocked. One of my favorite shows, Murder, She Wrote, actually in the 80s and 90s, did a whole episode where someone was staying at the actual Bates Motel in California, and they did a whole thing on that. So I love Psycho. My favorite scene, and I'll just say, is with the stairs when the guy gets attacked on the staircase. That scene comes out of nowhere, and I can't believe a movie from 50 years ago still has that suspense and that jump scare type thing that so many movies since have been trying to do. And I would also argue with many people do, that Psycho is the first slasher film ever made, or at least one of the most influential slasher films ever made. And they did it right, because everyone else, again, is just trying to copy them, including the really crappy remake from the 90s, which we shall not speak of. But it's amazing, amazing, amazing film. So, yeah, Psycho, for me, is number 3.
Yeah, once again, we'll probably talk about that before the show's over. Yep. And, but I'm going to talk, as I alluded to it before, I get to the Birds. Well, that's my number 3 is the Birds. We got Rod Taylor, we get Tippi Hedren, and Mark talked a lot about this place. What I like is the place that they go to is like this beautiful little like beach or island or wherever off the coast of San Francisco or wherever it is, and you're like, okay, it's a pristine looking place. It's got a little store, it's got a little school, it's got I mean, how could anything go wrong? Yet all these birds flock to this area, and they're like a terror. It's like these birds have nothing. Well, there was a little thing in the film. I don't know. Maybe I saw it in a special feature or a conversation or something. But there was like a siren that was leading the birds to this town, this little place that they were staying. It was like a siren, like birds and animals can hear things that we can't hear. Well, that's what was leading the birds there. There was a secret, like a sound kind of thing that was leading the birds there. And that's why they were doing it. They thought the people had this siren, this invisible sounding item that we could not hear, but they could hear. That is what led the birds to this sleepy little coast town off the coast of California. But you're right. I mean, yeah, today some of the special effects and stuff that are dated, but for the time it was pretty sinister. It was pretty sadistic what Alfred Hitchcock was doing to his stars of his film. And not only, they actually made a film about the making of the birds. It's called The Girl, starring Sienna Miller and Toby Jones. They show some of the things that Hitchcock did to Tippi Hedren in this film. And she came to the local art house cinema here where I live in Orlando about 4 or 5 years ago. She had a whole discussion about some of the things that Hitchcock did to her. And they had a whole screening of the birds, and she signed autographs and discussed the film and her career and whatnot. And ever since the birds, she's become a proponent of animals. So she bought a zoo, and all the money she does from these guest appearances when she goes around the country in different places talking about the birds and her career, all the money she raises goes into this zoo that she owns. And she has this thing about preserving animals and stuff. And it's all because of what she went through on the birds and what Hitchcock did to her on that film. So there's so many layers to the birds. When you're watching the film, you have so much you can think about that happened during the filming of the movie, and then afterwards with some of these actors' careers and so forth like that. But The Birds is a great, great film, and that's why it's number 3 on my top 5 Hitchcock films. All right, let's go back to Andrew for number 2.
My number 2 is a film that is one of my favorite films, perhaps of all time, and that is Vertigo from 1958. This film was a critical flop when it came out. People didn't really like it, and it is now regarded as one of the greatest films of all time. And this is a film starring Jimmy Stewart, who we've already mentioned a few times on here, and starring Kim Novak, who portrays another one of the Hitchcock blondes. And this film is really just in-depthly fascinating to me because it is one thing initially, and then it switches into something else. If you're not familiar with the plot of this film, Jimmy Stewart is kind of a private detective, but he has a fear of heights. So there's a famous opening sequence where he develops that fear of heights. He's chasing someone on rooftops, they fall off, he tries to grab them, and then he gets so afraid that he drops them. And it's iconic, and the shot itself is iconic. It's called the dolly zoom. It's been mimicked in films so many times over and over. Steven Spielberg did it in Jaws. There's one shot where Roy Scheider's character is sitting on the beach and there's a shark, and you see the dolly zoom. It is done by using a zoom lens and zooming in while pulling away with a dolly, with the camera on a dolly. And it is a shot I've always wanted to do myself to see if I could actually pull it off. But that's an iconic shot. And basically, Jimmy Stewart's character is hired to kind of follow the wife of an old friend of his, because the husband believes that she is either up to no good, or that she's sick and she may commit suicide or something like that. There's something wrong with her. And Jimmy Stewart just follows her around San Francisco. San Francisco is a place that Alfred Hitchcock really loved to shoot his films in. Alfred Hitchcock did not like to shoot on location. He hated shooting on location. That's why he shot most of his movies on sets, which didn't really service his films well as his career went on, because everybody was shooting on location, by the 60s and the 70s and stuff like that. But this is shot in San Francisco, and Jimmy Stewart basically becomes obsessed with this person. He becomes obsessed with this woman. He becomes obsessed almost with the idea of her versus her in actuality. And it's a film that deals with obsession of romance, a kind of psychosis that comes with it. And there's a famous kind of trippy sequence in this film with a lot of light and a lot of colors, and Hitchcock is just trying to give you an acid trip, basically. And I have always just loved this film. I loved it when I first saw it, and it works even more and more on repeat viewings.
All right.
So my number two is Rear Window. And I won't go too much into it because, of course, we've talked about it previously, and I sort of mimic everything Dan had said. I really love Rear Window. I love the fact that, again, he's sort of stationary. It all kind of takes place in one location, and I really love the set. I love that whole perspective of the courtyard in the apartment building, and how you can basically, he's there with his telescope, and he sees all his neighbors, and then he can see the alley where there's a bar in the back. And what I really love about the film is the fact that, you basically go back and forth on whether or not there's been a crime. Certain characters killed their wife, and it's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then, of course, by the end, we know what happens. And like Hitchcock always does, those last 10 minutes are really, really suspenseful, really harrowing. And yeah, it's incredible. But I watched this in film school for the first time, so this would have gone again back somewhere around seven or 8 years. And I was just, I'm telling you, captivated by the production design, captivated by that set where all those actors, Mrs. Lonely Heart and all of them are in their apartments, and he's basically spying on everyone because he's bored. I love that set so much. It's probably, I'd say, my favorite production design of any movie I've ever seen. And certainly one, if you're an art director, aspiring art director at all, or set designer, you have to watch Rear Window. It's absolutely fantastic. So yeah.
And the thing is, your boy M. Night Shyamalan tried. They wanted to compare like M. Night Shyamalan with Hitchcock a lot of time. And sometimes you look at some of his films and he does try different things. In a not very good effort, he does try to do something similar to Rear Window with Lady in the Water, all the people in the apartment and stuff. I always thought that was such a cool concept. I would like to have seen someone try that, but make it work instead of Lady in the Water, which it doesn't work at all, but have the multiple apartments and all kinds of stuff going on, and everybody's got their own little story and stuff. Nobody's had been able to capture something like that since Rear Window. That's the I mean, yeah, you have the four what was it, Four Bellman, or what was it, was a Stephen King adaptation or something a couple years ago where had the 4 apartments, but nobody's ever been able to capture that kind of this whole apartment or condo area or thing like that ever since Rear Window. I mean, they've done the remake with Christopher Reeve, which wasn't bad. It wasn't great, but wasn't bad. But it's odd you haven't seen that before. You know, that's the odd thing about Rear Window. You really haven't seen that particular type of story before, except for Lady in the Water. But really, that was such a bad effort. You can't really compare the two. But all right, Andrew, it's my number 2, right? Yeah, I'm going to go with Mark's number 3. I believe he had Psycho. I got Psycho at number 2. Janet Leigh, of course, Vera Miles, Anthony Perkins. What can you say? What can you say about Psycho that hasn't been said before? I mean, and the thing is, you know, Hitchcock's done some of his films in color and some of them in black and white. But what I like about this is the film is in black and white, but the blood is in color. If you look at the blood closely that's going down the drain in the scene where he's killing the Janet Leigh character, it's red. They were able to put some red in there to make the blood pop a little bit more in the scene, and that kind of makes that scene a little bit more effective. Also, you know, we're kind of in a weekend where we get prequels that are coming out, right? We got Annabelle Creation out this weekend. Well, this show, Psycho, this great film spawned a really good prequel TV show that just ended this past year called Bates Motel, with Freddie Highmore as Norman Bates. And I know they had Rihanna in there. I don't know why they picked her, but this last season was the season of Psycho, the actual story of Psycho from the movie. But they led up to it. They led up to it for the previous 2 or 3 seasons. And after the first season, I just got kind of bored with it. But I'm definitely going to go back and watch this season. I got a DVR and see how they handle the actual Psycho storyline involving the Janet Leigh character and the Vera Miles character, and obviously Norman Bates. Of course, you know, the previous seasons were more about his relationship with his mother and what drove him to go insane and get all crazy. And we see all of that in the film, obviously, because this is the first film. And they did make an awful, awful, awful scene-for-scene remake about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And they did it in color. I mean, what a mistake. I mean, if you're going to do it, at least do it in black and white. Why do it in color? I mean, they made so many mistakes with that. I think it was Gus Van Sant that made it.
Yep.
Bad choice on their part to do that. But Psycho, just one of the all-time great horror movies. And it is a horror movie. You know, Alfred Hitchcock is the master of suspense, but this, I would say, is like a horror movie. I mean, he's killing people. He's burying cars. He's burying people. That's what Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers are all based on, this character of Norman Bates. So this is a horror film. This is the beginning of the horror movie genre, if you will, even though Alfred Hitchcock is considered the master of suspense. So that's what I had at number 2. Going to Andrew for number 1.
My number one is the same as your guys' 3 and 2, and that is Psycho. Psycho was the first Alfred Hitchcock film I ever watched, and I wouldn't recommend doing that for people. I wouldn't recommend starting with Psycho just because you're seeing a master at his best.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? You're seeing Hitchcock in his prime. I highly recommend if you're ever getting into a director, especially a famous all-time director like Alfred Hitchcock, start with their obscure stuff. Start with their obscure stuff, their earlier stuff, and then work your way up to their more masterworks. Then you see the progression, you see their change and the refinery of their style, and it's a heck of a thing to watch, especially with Alfred Hitchcock, who would use a lot of the same things over and over again when it came to filmmaking and stuff like that. But Psycho was something that he hadn't done before. It's always something I think he wanted to do. He was always constantly pushing the boundary of what he could show on screen, what he could get away with. And in 1960, he was able to get away with something that shocked people. A film that threw away a lot of conventionalities. You know, when you first start off with the Marion Crane character, the Janet Leigh character, you think you're going to follow her throughout the whole movie. Oh, she's stealing money from her boss. She's trying to get away. Oh, she comes across this motel. Oh, so she's just going to stay there and then move on. No, the narrative changes there, and it's only within the first 25, 30 minutes of the movie that the main scene happens where she gets killed in the shower. And it's been, like Mark said, it's been parodied, it's been referenced over and over again. And what is so amazing about that scene is that at no point do you see her actually get stabbed. It is shot and edited in such a way where you never see any nudity, you never see her get stabbed. And that was the way Alfred Hitchcock was able to get away with it. You don't see the actual thing really happen. It's all in your mind. He basically just got you to the doorway, and you went through yourself. That is what made Hitchcock so amazing. Is that he just kind of opened up doorways, and you would go through them, and that's what he did with Psycho. And he changed the narrative to where it's now the film's about Norman Bates and his character journey, and you know right away that this is a weird character. This is somebody who there's not something quite right up there, and you see that he has this relationship with his mother character, and it's weird and it's creepy, and then of course you find out that he is the mother character. I mean, I hope I'm not spoiling this for you. The movie came out in 1960. It's been a little while. It's been a little while, and even if you know that, it's so much more interesting watching the film knowing that, because then you can see how oh yeah, now this makes sense. It was really him doing this, or it's really him doing that. And it's just absolutely fascinating when you're dealing with a lot of just interesting themes like the Oedipus complex and the obsession with the relationship between mother and son, and that is a lot what Dan referenced. The TV show gets into that a lot. And the TV show is interesting because it's a prequel, but it's also set in modern times. So it's not like it's distancing itself where it's being set in the 40s or 50s. It's set in modern times. Vera Farmiga plays Norma Bates, and she has just a very heavily interesting relationship with the Freddie Highmore Norman Bates character in that show. I highly recommend checking that out if you are a fan of Psycho. And also, this is completely aside, watch Psycho 2. I know that sounds crazy, and I know it's sacrilege, but it's really interesting because it would be, I kind of view it as what it would look like if Alfred Hitchcock didn't pass away in 1980, I believe, or 79, and he actually made films in the 80s. That's what it kind of looks like for me. And it was also shot by somebody who was a protege of Alfred Hitchcock, so it's kind of connected there somehow. So I would check that out. But yeah, Psycho is my favorite. It's a film that I think changed movies. And I also think it's kind of a coming attractions of what would happen in the decade of to come culturally. If you're aware, in the United States in the 1960s, it was a radically changing time in the culture. And I think Psycho was kind of an explosion of expression that would come in that generation. So it's one of my favorites of all time. It's in my top 10 somewhere, probably top 5. I've always gravitated heavily towards Psycho.
Cool. Great. Yeah, a lot of good Stay there, Andrew. All right, Mark, what is your number one?
My number one was previously mentioned, and it's North by Northwest. I love North by Northwest. I think it is such a thrilling film. It is such an edge of your seat, movie. I am a huge fan of Martin Landau, who just recently passed away. I met him a few years ago in Los Angeles, and he was super, super nice to me. And I also got to see recently another film of his called Crimes and Misdemeanors, Woody Allen movie, who I hope we do, or maybe you have done before, but I hope we do a top 5 Woody Allen sometime in the future, Dan, unless you've already done it. But
we have not done Woody Allen.
Well, that's got to be on one, but I will we'll go back to that and just say that North by Northwest it's incredible. I love James Bond movies. I love espionage movies. I love spy movies. I would also say another amazing spy sort of espionage movie with Cary Grant, of course, is Charade, which is a great, great movie with tons of twists with Walter Matthau and Audrey Hepburn. Charade is great. Charade is fantastic. And Cary Grant was just an amazing, suave, guy. He that accent, if I could imitate any accent, and I can't, unfortunately, if I could do any impression in the world, I would love to do a good, awesome Cary Grant. And one of my favorite scenes that I love, especially in movies, is the sort of mistaken identity trope. And I love when he goes, when he's taken to that house where I think he sees, I think it's James Mason and Martin Landau, but then they go back the next day, and of course I think he's with cops and they don't believe him. I love that stuff. I love that whole switcheroo kind of thing, and how things are what they seem. And then talk about an amazing, amazing ending, which of course we discussed, Dan, which was on a sort of a matted version, which would have been the pre-green screen version of Mount Rushmore. And Martin Landau, of course, is in that. He's the henchman. He's got a fairly big role at the end. And I again saw this one in film school. I saw Rear Window in one course, and then I saw North by Northwest in another course. And there's so many amazing things that come from this movie. What I will say about Hitchcock, so North by Northwest, Rear Window, Psycho, Birds, these are all incredibly seminal movies that are so influential on modern cinema. There's just absolutely no doubt. You watch a Hitchcock movie and you think to yourself, "Oh, I've seen this before." Well, not in the 50s and the 60s, or not in the 40s, the 50s and the 60s. Nobody saw this stuff before. I mean, nobody saw what Hitchcock was doing with North by Northwest, with Psycho. Nobody killed off an A-list celebrity like Vivian Leigh in the first quarter of the film. No one would dare to do that. So he was a risk taker. He was an inventor. He was absolutely an incredible filmmaker. And so I love only one filmmaker a little bit more, which is Stanley Kubrick. I absolutely can sit down and watch Alfred Hitchcock movies and devour them. He's got an incredible filmography. And as I said, if you are in film school, watch some of these movies, because you have to realize it was probably the first time ever in modern cinema that you would have been watching these tropes and these inventions that he was making. And incredible filmmaker. And I love North by Northwest for so many reasons. Also, the James Bond connection. I love James Bond, so of course I also love this film. So yeah.
Yeah, North by Northwest is such an amazing film. I mean, there's so many great things about it. So many great things that filmmakers would take years later. And one of the other things I love about Hitchcock is, if you ever watch the architecture in his films, like the buildings, the houses, he figures a way to get some of the most interesting places in his films. And that's part of what Andrew said, is he goes out on location, he finds these places, and I'll tell you what, he makes me want to go to San Francisco by watching my number one film is Vertigo. I mean, you talk about a beautiful place. He makes San Francisco look like one of the best places on the face of the earth. I mean, in watching Vertigo, this place is amazing. I mean, I'm sure he doesn't take me to the seedy, nasty side of San Francisco. Or back when this film was being filmed, it was probably a lot nicer than it is today. But San Francisco looks absolutely beautiful in Vertigo. But the main thing is we got Jimmy Stewart once again. I said he is a theme going throughout this episode of the Top 5 Weekly. And another theme is Hitchcock blondes. Kim Novak, she actually plays a brunette and a blonde in this film. Like Andrew said, he brings you off in this one direction, then you go off, you completely take a left turn, and you go off in this other direction. And the beginning of the film is really crazy because he's chasing this guy, and that's where we get the whole vertigo thing. He realizes he's got vertigo because he starts looking down and he can't look down. He gets scared. You know, it's funny because one of my favorite baseball players, one of my favorite baseball teams, Boston Red Sox, well, my favorite, has a player, his name is Brock Holt, who ended up with vertigo. He was out for like months of the season. He had vertigo. How does a baseball player get vertigo? I don't know. But in Vertigo, Jimmy Stewart, like Andrew said, he does he does this kind of investigative deal where he's following this woman around, and she's got this kind of connection to this other woman who's in this painting, and then she visits her gravestone. She's like some kind of a psychic connection to this woman or whatever, and that's the information that her husband was looking for. That's why he hired the Jimmy Stewart character in the film to go and look into this. But little does he know that Jimmy Stewart actually fell in love with his wife, or who he thinks is his wife. And then this whole kind of stuff happens where they have to go to the top of this like steeple or this like Spanish building in once again another beautiful part of San Francisco, and he can't go to the top because of his vertigo. And so they trick him in believing that she had fallen to her death. Of course, this is a trick. This movie came out over 50 years ago. So if you haven't seen Vertigo, I'm sorry. It's your mistake, not mine, for talking about it. Go out and see this film. It is a great film. I even have a shirt of Vertigo right here. That is my Vertigo shirt. If you haven't seen me wear that shirt before, I love this movie so much. That's why I got this shirt. I mean, I could have wore this shirt or my Hitchcock shirt. I have a Hitchcock shirt as well. And it's got a bunch of scenes from his movies on the shirt in his head, like a big Hitchcock head. And it's got like scenes from Psycho, scenes from North by Northwest, scenes from The Birds, all within a art sculpture of the Hitchcock head, which is a famous, you know, he is such a famous director. All you have to do is see like an art thing of his head, and you know it's Hitchcock. You couldn't do that with any other actor or director. This guy's got a body and a head that's so distinctive that you know his head in his body 50, 60 years later. Like they put it on boxes, they put it on DVDs, they put it on T-shirts. They do different things with the physique of Alfred Hitchcock, which is really an odd little thing about the man. But Vertigo, the cinematography, like Andrew said, the camera work, whatever, it just lends you to want to be involved in this film, be part of Vertigo, and like you're driving around the streets with the Jimmy Stewart character, and then you're visiting all these different museums and little parks and all just a beautiful, beautiful film. But yeah, it's my number one because I didn't see it early on. Like I saw like The Birds and Psycho, and Rear Window and some of these films really early on, back in the 70s. I mean, early 80s, just not the 70s, but the early 80s. But I didn't see Vertigo till like the 90s, and I had missed out on Vertigo in the Alfred Hitchcock filmography, and so I regretted. But when I finally saw it, I realized what a great film it was, and how many different things that Hitchcock does in the film that really, it's one of those films you have to keep watching it, and you see these little clues that are in the film the more you watch it. It's kind of like one of my other films that I love, Casablanca. It's got like things that if you watch it over time, over and over and over again, you see these little clues that he leaves within the film. And that's why I had Vertigo at my #1 Alfred Hitchcock film. And if you go on the AFI's 100 Greatest Movies of All Time, I believe you're going to see Vertigo as the #1 film, because they redid the list a few years ago, and Citizen Kane got beat out by Vertigo, I think. I could be wrong, but I believe Vertigo is #1 now. All right. Andrew, you got any honorable mentions?
Alfred Hitchcock, 53 films, and I would suggest watching them all. But some of my other favorites that I didn't mention were, of course, Rear Window and The Birds are up there. But for me, another film that I really love is To Catch a Thief, Dial M for Murder, I Confess, which stars one of my favorite actors of all time, Montgomery Clift. But even a lot of other of his 40s works that I know people are not too familiar with is the films of Saboteur, Shadow of a Doubt, Lifeboat are all really, really great. And I highly recommend checking out his 1940s black and white films. They're really, really good. His first stuff he did when he first came over to Hollywood. Foreign Correspondent is another one, which I have watched so many times. I wrote a paper on that one too, and it's a really good movie. He had like 2 films nominated for Best Picture in 1940. Rebecca, which I mentioned, and Foreign Correspondent. It's really, I don't know when, I think the last time you saw that was Steven Soderbergh had 2 films nominated for Best Picture, with Traffic and Erin Brockovich, I believe, were both nominated for Best Picture at the same time. So that doesn't happen very often. But I know Dan and Mark probably have a few more they want to mention.
All right, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. I really love Strangers on a Train. That's a really great film. I love Lifeboat. Lifeboat is so creepy. Again, a single setting, just, not sure what's going on. That was, I think obviously that was it during the war? It would have been during the war that I think early 40s.
44.
Yeah, so during the war, there's a German involved. And love Dial M for Murder, Foreign Correspondent, Sabotage is fantastic. I would say, like what Andrew just said, watch every single Hitchcock movie. Try to do it in chronological order if you can. But yeah, for me, Strangers on a Train. I also, by the way, watched Vertigo a couple years ago. I don't love it, unfortunately. I'm going to have to watch it again. For whatever reason, I was not captivated by that film. I was extremely bored. So it is one that I have to watch again, I know. But I kind of, at the end of the movie, was like, okay. So I'm going to watch that one again because you guys really, really love it. And I'm sure I'm missing something on that one. That I can admit I'm probably missing something. My opinion on that film, I'm sure, is wrong. The other films that have a controversial view on, I'm right. But I will admit that I could be wrong on Vertigo. So.
Yeah, I want to recommend The Lodger if you haven't seen it. It's a silent film, but he did a remake of his own film 3 years later. But the remake of his film isn't as good as the original black and white silent film version of The Lodger. This is his first film, basically his first big film, if I'm not mistaken. Then a film I think Andrew owns, I have not gotten yet, but it's called A Lady Vanishes.
Oh, yeah.
And I have not seen it, but I want to recommend it because I hear it's really good. And Stephen and Andrew have talked about it before. And I am going to get The Lady Vanishes very soon. But I know Andrew has seen it and he loves it. But the film that I haven't heard anybody talk about yet is a film I actually watched today because I haven't seen it in quite a while. Is The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Yeah.
Another Jimmy Stewart film, which I said Jimmy Stewart is going to be a theme throughout this episode of Alfred Hitchcock. The Man Who Knew Too Much. Wow, what a fantastic film this is. And you got another theme that goes through Alfred Hitchcock. Albert Hall, this music hall in England and London that he uses a lot. He likes to have crazy things go on at Albert Hall in London for some reason. And this time there's an assassination plot, and Jimmy Stewart has to stop an assassination plot of this king or whatever, this lead prime minister of this country. But I put in there The Man Who Knew Too Much as a film that we have not talked about. Mark, everybody, both of you guys have talked about all my honorable mentions. I have them all written here. You guys, Strangers on a Plane, they are making a remake. Yeah. I hope it's good. I hope it's good. But it's like, oh, you hate to see your great favorite films get these remake treatments because normally they're not even close to being as good as the original. Now, 3:10 to Yuma, I would say I think the remake is better. So we get that occasionally with remakes, but not normally. Strangers on a Train is such an absolute favorite of mine. I just hope they don't mess it up. It's gonna have Ben Affleck in it, so I can see Ben Affleck in the one character, the role of the one guy in Strangers on a Train. Can you see Ben Affleck in that one character, the tennis player's role, Mark?
I mean, I like Ben Affleck, but it's almost sacrilegious to make a movie like, remake a movie like that. So I don't know.
Yeah. Did you have something else you want to say, Andrew?
Yeah, there was another film I wanted to mention. The Wrong Man, starring Henry Fonda, is so underrated in his filmography that no one talks about it. And it's basically essentially what the title suggests. Henry Fonda is accused for a crime he didn't commit. But this idea that Hitchcock is playing on the idea that his greatest fear was authority, or specifically the police, because they have this authority to accuse you of committing a crime, and it's your word against theirs, and they are the authority. They can whether it's right or wrong, they can harm you. And that film deals with a lot of that. Also deals with kind of the breakdown of the middle class, the middle class society of the 1950s. It's a fascinating movie. It's all in black and white. It's his least stylized movie. So I thought I would mention that one for kind of out of the box recommendation.
All right, well, that is our show. I just want to say thank you to Andrew and Mark for coming on this special episode 1 of a special 4-part series that I'm doing, Top 5 Weekly Classics Month. Andrew, where can you be found?
You can find me on Twitter at Cabzilla06, as well as my YouTube channel, Cabzilla Productions.
And Mark?
Please follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Mark Tordai, MarkTordai, and I am relaunching my YouTube channel with my friend Gordon. Please check us out at AccelVids, ACCELVIDS, and we are just about to put our first reviews online on YouTube. So I'm really looking forward to getting back to reviewing movies.
We look forward to seeing you do some more videos, Mark. You can always find me at Dan Cabral on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest, or at From the Fourth Row. Also, like I said, we do a special series called The 52 Must-See Movies and Why They Matter. Andrew and Mark, myself, and Stephen and Billy have all been on episodes. So if you like listening to people talk about classic movies and breaking them down, that is a great series. There's going to be 52 episodes. I just put up the latest episode, 7 Samurai, the Akira Kurosawa classic with Andrew and Steven. Also, I do a podcast with Vinny Laspada called The Best Damn Movie Show, so you can go on Facebook and see that, or also SoundCloud.com. We're going to be getting back to it. We haven't been able to do an episode in a few weeks because of our schedules. But all these episodes of the Top 5 Weekly and the 52 must-see movies, why they matter, can all be found at the Best Damn Movie Show YouTube channel. And I also do my own movie reviews on my YouTube channel called Dan Allen. So you can go there and look at my reviews as well. So for Andrew and Mark, good night.
See ya.